Hello, everyone. It's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to continue some of the content from class. We didn't get a chance to really look at the market so much in the perfectly competitive model. So remember, we have a supply and demand curve. This would be the quantity of workers in the markets. Let's say this is a factor market for workers, and this would be the wage. Remember, the firm in the perfectly competitive model, the firm is taking the wage. This is referred to as the marginal resource cost, the cost of the very next worker. Okay, so if this is the first worker, second worker, third worker, and so on, and this is the MRP, okay, we know that the firm is going to hire the quantity of workers where MRP is equal to MRC, but something we haven't talked a lot about is how are wages set in the market and what happens to the interaction of supply and demand. We also need to talk about the model of monopsony, so both of those topics are included in this video. The very first thing that I want to note is just a vocabulary thing. Sometimes you'll see the difference between the word nominal wages and real wages, and just so you have a little bit of a sense of the difference between them, nominal wages are wages that we might think of if somebody got a new job and you asked them, hey, how much money are you making? And they told you an actual figure, whether it was per hour or per day or per year, a salary for the year. That's their nominal wage. And nominal wages can increase or whatnot, but really significantly, we're also interested in real wages, and real wages are affected by price increases like inflation. So right now, we see a lot of people experiencing real wages that are declining. Even if they experience a nominal wage increase, they might actually not be able to purchase the exact same amount of goods as they were last year because of the increase in inflation. And that's what we mean by real wages. What is it that you can actually buy? And that becomes important, especially in our current context, okay? The way that we're looking at the perfectly competitive model, right? We have a market, a demand, and a supply. That's where the wage is set. And we also have the firm, okay, MRP and MRC. We know that the key question for the firm is how many workers should the firm produce, or how many machines should the firm rent, and that's going to be where MRP equals MRC. But we didn't really look so much at what sets the wage in the market. And one thing to note is the demand curve in the market is really going to increase or decrease as a result of what happens with MRP. The market demand curve in a factor market is coming from a summation of all firms' marginal revenue product curve, okay? Firms that are in this particular market. So the demand curve is kind of like a mirror reflection of what's happening at the MRP curve, okay? So what are things that can affect the MRP, and as a result, the market demand curve? One thing, of course, is the demand for the actual product. Remember, this is a factor market, so what you're graphing in the factor market, we're looking at the quantity of workers, right, that might be attached to a particular product. So these might be hat makers, okay, not the hat itself. The hat and the product market, the hat is being produced in the product market. The factor market is buying and selling of the resources, such as hat makers. The demand or price of the product can increase. If the demand for hats goes up, everybody wants to be a hat maker because they're in demand as well. That's derived demand. If nobody wants hats anymore, then hat makers are going to be, laid off, right? Nobody wants to be a hat maker if nobody wants hats. That's the concept behind derived demand. If there's an increase in demand of the product, we would see the price increase, and we'd see MRP shift to the right, and as a result, the market demand curve would shift to the right, okay? You're largely going to be asked questions about the resource demand shifting in the firm, and look carefully to make sure, where do I have to answer this question? Is it in the firm, okay, here, or is it in the market? Again, the market demand curve is shifting right or left. Generally, you're not using demand curve shifts to showcase then an increase in the wage, okay? In this case, Unlike the product market and perfect competition, we're very interested in what's happening with the supply curve, okay? The supply curve shifting. But other things that can shift the marginal revenue product curve, in addition to the price increasing or decreasing, productivity of the resource can shift the MRP curve. And that would be your marginal product, right? Remember, marginal product is generally something that's decreasing with every next worker. And then price of related resources. That's another thing that can actually have an impact on increasing or decreasing MRP and therefore your market demand. If your market demand curve does change, just note that your wage would be reset. So one of the reasons why a wage could be increased or decreased would have to do with your market demand. There's also a market supply curve. And if we look at the market supply curve, it's upward sloping. The more the wage is going to be higher and higher and higher, there's going to be a direct relationship. More and more and more people want to put their hats in the ring to work in a certain job when the wages are much higher. There are certain determinants of the shifting of supply in the market, okay? We're not talking about the MRC curve in the firm. We're talking about the market supply curve. One thing that can cause a shift would be an actual literal number of workers increasing or decreasing. This could be related to the immigration, right? An increase in the supply of the resource. More oil is found, and oil is a resource. Maybe more workers have migrated to a particular country. That becomes a supply increase, okay? You can also have a particular decrease in the supply of workers if there are changes made to licensing, if all of a sudden there's going to be a PhD required in order to be an occupational therapist, rather than a master's degree, that's going to put the supply of occupational therapists shift left because it's going to be harder to become that particular job, okay? We know that wages tend to be indicative of where there is a great number of qualified workers. We tend to have really large supply, and in that case, lower wages, okay? So childcare workers don't have, if lots of people can become without a lot of training child care workers. And so lots and lots of people are in that supply of labor. If we take something very specialized, like a, kind of subset of some type of neurosurgery, that becomes a very specialized, very, very few supply, right? So the supply curve would be much, much, much smaller, and we would end up, or much decreased curve, we'd end up with a much higher wage, okay? So just to give you an idea. Other things that can also affect the supply curve would be, in some cases, societal values, right? Maybe looking at during the time period of World War II in the 1950s and the 1960s, there became a feminist movement. We see many more women going out to work. Some of this is maybe overblown. There's probably always large numbers of women in the workforce, but to some degree, certain groups of women, married white women, whatever, coming into the workforce, much larger quantities in the 1940s and the 1950s. This has a whole bunch of implications, but it shifts the supply curve to the right, okay? So actual differences in the quantity of workers, the quantity of machines, whatever the actual factor is, those are things you're looking for in terms of the shifts in supply. Okay, one quick thing in case it comes up just as a term is the backward bending supply curve of labor. This is an individual supply curve. So we said the market supply curve is upward sloping, and it looks like this, right? It's households who are interested in offering their labor for a particular job, or it's the supply of robots or some other type of capital, or it's the supply of land, okay? If you have a individual supply curve. Sometimes we call it backward bending, and the simple reason is this: as wages increase, somebody is going to be working more and more and more. As the wage goes all the way up to here, we see more and more and more work. At a certain point, when the wage gets high enough, an individual is making enough money that they may actually work less at a certain point, and the supply curve starts to backward bend, because when you're wealthy enough, you can actually afford a little bit of leisure. So this idea that on an individual level, we will always work more when a wage increases, to some degree that's true. If I said, hey, come mow my lawn for $2,000, you would definitely do it. And then maybe you'd come and do it again and come and do it again. But at a certain point, you might not need to do it anymore because you'd be wealthy enough to have some leisure time. Okay, so the individual supply curve looks a little different than the upward sloping supply curve for the market. It's really the market supply curve that's the most important thing. Okay, and we can practice this just a little bit. Let's imagine that this is just the market. We are not graphing the firm and the wages effect on a perfectly competitive firm. Just know that whatever changes happen in the market would mean that the firm would take on a new wage. So if you were doing some side-by-side graphing, you would change the wage, the marginal resource cost in the firm. In this case, the state passes legislation requiring new teachers to pass competency tests in order to be employed by any school in the state. Okay, and if this is the labor market for teachers, we know that this would be a supply shift to the left, because now it becomes harder to be a teacher, so we can assume that there will be a lower supply. In this next case, new training methods are increasing the productivity of workers. Productivity is really the key word that should shout to you marginal product, which should tell us that marginal product is part of marginal revenue product. So we know that this is something that's going to affect the demand. What will happen to the market demand if we have new training methods increasing the productivity of workers? We're going to see an increase in the demand of the auto workers. Okay, they're going to be market demand. This is a reflection of the increase in MRP. Okay, so just kind of note that. In this case, the U.S. government relaxes a tough immigration law, making it easier for construction workers from other countries to enter the United States. Okay, if this is the relaxing of a law, now more people are going to be coming to the United States. This is going to be an increase in supply, and as a result, a lower wage and a greater quantity of workers. Okay, so greater quantity of workers, lower wage, and an increase in supply. Okay, and if we do this one right here, the German government lowers tariffs on shoes imported to Germany, and we're interested in the market for shoemakers. So remember, this is the number of workers, the market for shoemakers. There's also a product market, right? And the product market is for shoes in Germany, demand for shoes, supply for shoes. This is the product market. And the quantity here and the price of the product here. So if there is lower tariffs, right, there's going to be greater competition and greater greater quantity of shoes. What we're going to see is an increase in supply for the shoes, right? There's going to be an increase in shoes, but that's also going to lead to a lower price. What does that mean for shoemakers in Germany? That's going to be a MRP shift left, but also a demand shift left in the market. Okay, it makes sense, kind of more competition, lower price for shoes, lower price or lower wage rather for the shoemakers in Germany, as well as lower quantity of those folks employed. Okay. Labor unions conduct a successful advertising campaign urging people to buy goods and services produced by American workers. And this could be another thing if lots of people are buying goods and services produced by American workers. So this is just kind of increasing the demand for the products that American workers produce, therefore increasing demand for American workers, raising the wage for American workers, and raising the quantity of American workers. So always keep in mind that this is derived demand. Demand in the factor market is not the same as demand in the product market. Firms are participating in both, and these are markets that actually connect to each other a little bit, okay? Wage differentials. So what is it that creates a wage that's very, very different? So we have a demand and maybe a supply curve that looks like this. In another type of market, you might have a demand curve and a supply curve that looks like this. So clearly the intersection of supply and demand is going to really differentiate wages, and explains why, for example, neuroscientists or neurosurgeons make a great deal more money than child care workers, okay? In addition to things like differences in human capital and differences in talent and all of those access to productive resources like laptops and capital and things like that. There's other things that also affect wages. Of course, there can be discrimination. There can be policies related to unions. So not everything is necessarily detailed in the supply and demand graph as we have looked at it in class. We're going to carefully just lay out the Monopsony model. For the purpose of the quiz, expect to see a few questions on this, and we will refer to it again later on in the week. We'll make sure to come back to this topic, but here's the basic idea. It is very, very much like the monopoly model. We have one firm that's hiring all of the workers. Typically, we see this in a labor market. It could exist for other factors, but let's assume we're talking about a labor market where the firm is large enough to really manipulate the market. We kind of make an assumption that workers would be relatively immobile in the situation. So maybe in a rural community where there's one hospital, the hospital is the only hiring facility for a great number of people who have jobs in the medical field, say like physicians. And in this case, the firm is a wage maker. Okay, we're going to see one graph here. The firm and the market are the same, and the firm does not have to take the wage from the market. They are a wage maker. Okay, so we're going to see an upward sloping wage or supply curve. That's going to be important. To hire additional workers, the firm has to increase the wage. In the perfectly competitive model, we assume that every next worker is making the exact same wage. In the case of the Monopsony model, we assume that we're suggesting that every single worker has to make, if the firm wants to hire more workers, they have to keep increasing the wage. This gives us that direct relationship between the quantity of workers and the wage, okay? So that would be what the supply curve will look like for both the firm and the market. The monopsony has something in common with the monopoly, okay? So first of all, note here the wage rate. This is the way, if we were to graph this, we would have the supply curve, right? How many workers will who will want to be employed when the wage rate is $4, $4.50, $5, and so on, right? So we can actually kind of graph, in a sense, what the firm's supply curve would look like as the wage increases, the quantity of workers would increase. At the same time, we're going to see that the marginal resource cost does not equal the wage, okay? Why is this the case, okay? We are going to see the supply of labor, okay? That's what we looked at with the wage. So a wage of maybe $4 and $5 and $6 and $7 and whatnot is leading to, increasing and increasing and increasing points on the x-axis, right? We're looking at increased relationship between wage and the quantity of workers, a direct relationship. But the MRC is actually upward sloping, but less than supply. When the firm hires the next worker and the next worker and the next worker, the firm has to increase the wage, but it will also, unless they can wage discriminate, okay, and pay every next worker a different wage, we're making the assumption that the firm has to pay every single worker the exact same wage, okay? So if I hire Keon to work for me and he's going to make, $5 an hour, and then I hire Sam to work for me and I have to raise the wage a little bit and I'm going to hire Sam at $5.50, it's going to cost me $5.50 to hire Sam, but it's also going to cost me 50 cents more to actually get Keon as well, because in order to get two workers, I have to pay them both the same wage and I have to increase the wage. So when I increase the wage to get Sam for $5.50, Keon is also making that increased wage. And then when I go to hire a third worker, I hire Christina. Now she's additionally going to be, $6, but I have to go back and add another dollar because I'm, kind of adding another 50 cents to the, wage from the $5.50 to the $6. Every worker that's hired previously has to be kind of compensated at the new higher wage. So the actual marginal revenue cost is greater than the points on the supply curve, okay? You'll recognize this as the monopoly model, literally upside down, okay? Instead of the downward sloping demand curve and MR less than demand, we have an upward sloping supply curve and MRC is greater than supply, okay? Like the monopoly curve, how do we work with this, okay? So first of all, this is the firm and this is the market, okay? Let's say that this is, this is Anna's hospital and it is in a rural area and it is a monopsony. How many workers or how many nurses, for example, will Anna's hospital hire, where MRC is equal to MRP? Look at the quantity that's there. So kind of the quantity that's there, that's the quantity of workers that will be hired, okay? Where MRC is equal to MRP. Note a few things about that quantity. First of all, the quantity is less than what the perfectly competitive market, where supply and demand would intersect, the perfectly competitive market would hire more workers. So the monopsony model is it's like hiring fewer workers than what a perfectly competitive market would do. Not only that, we're hiring the quantity of workers at Q, but the wage resists the urge to do this. That is not the wage. The firm can use the supply curve to figure out what the wage should be. So rather than hiring workers at a higher wage, if this quantity of workers is what is the right quantity to hire, that's the profit maximizing quantity, then the wage can be held. This quantity of workers will work according to the supply curve for wage W. Okay, so we have a firm that is not only under hiring workers, the workers are getting a lower wage than workers would get if there was a perfectly competitive market. The wage would be here at W1, okay? So we have an inefficient model, and because where supply and demand intersect is basically the allocative efficiency, okay? Sorry, I think I was goofing my camera up, so I'm not sure what I'm still going. Okay, I'm sorry, my camera was all mixed up. We do have dead weight loss in a market like this. We have dead weight loss because this is sorry, my camera got all mixed up. We have dead weight loss just as we do in the product market, because we're not allocatively efficient, okay? We have inefficiency in this market. We have dead weight loss, okay? The monopsony model very much is the same theory as the monopoly model in the product market. It is inefficient. It is a firm and market graph together. And it also does tell us that we can have a situation where we have a quantity of workers that is lower than the market quantity and a wage that is going to be less than the market wage would be in perfect competition, okay? That is really the key takeaway. There are some instances where we could look at minimum wage and how minimum wage might connect to a monopsony model. Typically, we would say a minimum wage has a tendency to decrease the quantity of workers when it's applied to a perfectly competitive market model. In the case of a monopsony, we could actually see that we might get a different outcome. We'll look at that in class a little bit, but for the quiz, do know the market monopsony model. Do understand that MRC and supply curve are upward sloping and that MRC is greater than supply. There is one of the free response question, the very last free response question in the packet that you have. I'll do those free response questions for you, so you have a video of that, but the free response question, the very last one, is a monopsony one. Try that, see if you understand the content, okay? That is really key takeaways. We're going to leave it there, and I will see you in class on Thursday. If you have questions on the quiz, just ask.